Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lara Tamaya. I am one of the board directors at the Hawaii Economic Association. Wanted to welcome you all to our event where we'll be doing an interview with some UHERA researchers that looked into social networks and in Hawaii schools and how they affect inequality here. So some housekeeping items before we jump into it. The Hawaii Economic Association is a nonprofit dedicated to economic education for the public here in the state. We generally do that through events such as these, where we examine an issue through the lens of economics and using economic tools. For HEA members, please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to submit any questions. This event is being recorded, so we will be sharing it on our YouTube channel later on. If you're not a member yet, please feel free to use the link at the bottom of this screen, or go to this address to join us. And um, let us know if there are any other events or interesting topics that you think we should explore. So for today's webinar, we're going to provide an interview with Dylan Moore and Jensen Ahokovi, both with the University of Hawaii Economic Research Organization, UHERO. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves because I actually want to hear a little bit more about them, and I think that their stories would be of interest for you as well. So I'll start with Dylan. You're noted up here first. Let me
Hi
ask you,
everyone.
please
Sorry.
introduce yourself. Let us know, how'd you get into economics? How'd you get into this?
Sure. It's been so long that it's hard for me to remember now exactly all of the reasons that I got interested in economics in the first place. But the things I study today, I became interested in because I had a lot of interesting professors who taught me about public policy and tax policy in particular. And those are the things I spend a lot of time thinking about now is how public policy can affect people's lives and how tax policy can affect people's lives. It's something that has fascinated me now for at least, for the last 6 years, but in retrospect, really well before that. So I don't know, it's hard to pin down exactly, but I've just always been drawn to these questions.
I feel like I hear that a lot. Jensen, how about you?
Yeah, I was born and raised in Kaneohe, and I took an econ class in my senior year of high school, and that sparked my interest. And then I chose to major in econ over at UH, and met Dylan and many other great professors who have definitely helped me along my journey to refine my interest and what I want to what public policy issues I want to think about. And econ definitely provides a very good toolkit to think about these public policy questions that Dylan was alluding to. So yeah, I'd say similar to Dylan, I'm very interested in that intersection of how thinking in an economic framework can help us inform public policy decisions.
And so I'm gonna guess the for both of you is this kind of public policy implications. Is that kind of what got you into or sparked this idea for this line of research that you did?
I think I'll sort of embarrass Jensen on this question because so I want to be clear that although I contributed a lot to this brief, I think Jensen was the sort of driving force behind producing it. So I'll defer to his explanation for why he decided he wanted to give this his particular attention.
Yeah, I'll say I went to public school from kindergarten to sixth grade in Kailua. So I went to Aikahi Elementary, And then from there, I transitioned from 7th grade to Iolani School in Honolulu. And so I'm sure many of you know what Iolani is, but for people who don't, it's a private school in the heart of Honolulu. Um, and so I was there from 7th grade, and I graduated from there in 2021. So I spent half of my early education in public school, and the other half in private school. And even though I went to Iolani for middle school and high school, I can definitely say that our household income was definitely not the typical average Iolani student's household income, and that's why I was very grateful to receive great financial support from the school. And I remembered definitely from the moment I stepped on campus, I definitely could tell that this was a private school. This was a private school for sure. And during my time there, it became abundantly clear to me that this school, and more generally the type of school that I was at, affords a lot of opportunities to students that you would not expect the typical public school to offer, at least here in Hawaii. And I could tell that the school was very interested in producing high quality graduates. And that's not to say that the public school system here is not doing they're not with similar goals, but there's definitely a disparity in the sorts of resources that the high school I went to had versus the public school that I would have went to had I not gotten into Iolani. And then lo and behold, turns out there's a good body of research on this kind of topic. How many everybody says, tell me your friends and I can, sort of tell you who you are. And there's a lot of research on that, especially from the folks at Opportunity Insights, researchers such as Raj Chetty and others who've looked at this idea of social networks and how your friends can impact your future outcomes. And I saw that and found out they had data for Hawaii. And I talked to Dylan and I said, hey, let's look into this. Nobody's really looked into it for Hawaii, so it would be interesting for sure.
Yeah, and full disclosure, I'm from Hilo. I went to public schools throughout elementary to high school. Um, I have two, I have two kids now that are actually at Iolani. So I think I can relate to your experience because even with time, they they have opportunities and exposure to things that I never would have. So that is a lot of the reason that your brief and your guys' research did spark an interest for me and why I wanted to get you guys on and just kind of talk story about it. And I do feel, it's ubiquitous, right? You meet somebody here and one of the first things you ask, where you went. And everybody knows exactly what you mean. But this is the first time I've ever seen economists actually do some analysis, do the research, put some numbers behind it to say how much does that really matter, you know? So can you describe for the audience a little bit? Um, I do encourage everybody, sorry, I should have said this. I encourage everybody to read their brief. It goes by roughly the same name as this event. And it's a very brief brief. It packs a lot in there though. And there's a lot of implications for it. So I do encourage you to take 10, 15 minutes, read through it, and think about it. But can you explain for us, at least at a high level, what was your methodology here? Like, what did you do?
Well,
Benson, can you, yeah.
Yeah, so most definitely, pretty much all of the heavy lifting was done by the researchers at Opportunity Insights. really all we're doing is just taking a lot of the data that they worked hard to get and just zoomed in on Hawaii. So definitely a lot of the credit goes to them for putting all of this together. But to give a basic description of the data, so a lot of the data actually comes from Facebook. So Facebook provided, I think, around 70 to 80 million different data points on users. Obviously, everything was anonymized, so privacy and everything was taken into consideration. And basically, the researchers are taking all this Facebook data and merging it with all sorts of different publicly available data sets, such as the American Community Survey, the decennial census, the current population survey. And they're taking all this data and merging it together to create this very granular data set of people's, what zip code people are from, how many friends do they have, what high school they went to. And they pull all this information together, and they use it to basically construct a measure of socioeconomic status, or in the brief, we refer to that in the acronym SES. And they basically use that to then look at, say, a person's social networks and ask how many of this person's friends are rich, how many of them have high socioeconomic status, and how many of them are low socioeconomic status. And then from there, they kind of do a bunch of magic with a bunch of math, and then they pull out a measure known as economic connectedness. And so at a simple level, economic connectedness is how many or what proportion of a person's friend group or social network is rich, to put it into simple terms. And in particular, the measure of connectedness should be seen from the perspective of a poor person. So specifically, how many friends does a poor person have that are rich, basically? And so there's definitely a lot more nuance in it, and you can definitely find the papers available on Google if you just look up probably economic connectedness. But not to get too far into the weeds, that's basically what the data looks like. Dylan, do you want to touch on anything else? Did I miss anything?
Yeah, just to add a little more nuance there. So it's our definition of high versus low SES here is above versus below median, I believe. Is that correct, Jensen?
Right.
So when we say a rich person here, we really just mean someone who has a socioeconomic status that's in the top 50%. And a poor person is someone who's in the bottom 50%. I'm pretty sure that's correct. Yeah, the measure that they make it slightly strange, but it does boil down to something pretty simple at the end of the day. People who have a higher number or places that have a higher number, what that means is that the low socioeconomic status people here have more high socioeconomic status friends than you would expect if they were just making friends at random, right? Like, so you get a bigger number if you have a low SES people on average, more of their friends are high SES. You get a lower number if the opposite is true. That's what it boils down to.
Great, thank you. And then so let's not tease anymore. What was the result? What did you find?
Sure. So Hawaii, it turns out, is the fourth highest among U.S. states in terms of this measure of economic connectedness. And specifically, the score that they give Hawaii is 1.04. How should we interpret that score? Well, the simplest way to do it is just divide the score by 2. And what you get is 1.04 divided by 2 just happens to be 0.52. And that tells you that on average, the typical person of low socioeconomic status in Hawaii, 52% of their friends are of high socioeconomic status or are rich. That's how you should interpret interpret that number. If you boil it down to the county level, Honolulu is up at the top in the top 5% of all US counties in terms of economic connectedness. Now, mind you, there are a lot of US counties, close to 4,000, but still top 5%. And I believe Honolulu County, I should probably pull up the numbers on my screen. Yeah, so I believe Honolulu County has 1.12. Once again, do the math, just above 50%. And then if you go down to Hawaii County, which is the county with the lowest economic connectedness among the Hawaii counties, they have a connectedness score of below 1 at 0.89. So you can see that there is still variation within the state, despite the fact that we rank fairly high. And in the brief, we also break it down further. We go down to the zip code level. It turns out that the top 5 zip codes with the highest economic connectedness here are Laie, Aina Haina, Hawaii Kai, Kailua, and Kaneohe. And the bottom 5 are Discovery Harbor, Mountain View, Hawaiian Beaches, Captain Cook. All those 4 are on the outer islands. And the lowest zip code in terms of economic connectedness is Waianae, which is here on Oahu. And there's other results of the paper or of the brief, but I'll kind of stop there and see if you want to touch on any of those.
No, sure. I mean, so just to kind of make it a little more real. So if on average, we're basically saying on average, we live in Honolulu. So my kids, um, out of 10 friends, 6 of them are going to be in that higher economic status, and 4 will be in that like lower economic status, right? Because we're just going binary, one or the other.
Not necessarily. So I don't
Okay,
know if you would not if I don't know if you would classify yourself as a person of low socioeconomic status, but remember the numbers should be interpreted from the perspective of people from low socioeconomic status. So that score
got
for
it.
Hawaii, remember that 52% number, that tells us that for the average poor person in Hawaii, 52% of their friends are considered rich or wealthy or high socioeconomic status, to be technical.
Perfect. Thank you. That's the distinction I wanted to make sure that we got across. So I wanna take this into the schools that you looked into when you broke it down by schooling. Um, and I'll flash up real quickly just a snippet from your brief. This is just a quick snip that I took, um, showing, by school where they ranked in terms of their economic connectedness that you found. And I do want to get into, so what does this mean when it turns into in terms of inequality or in terms of income? But I thought that this chart was a really good data visualization of where the schools rank, and especially breaking it down by color with public and private, because the top is dominated by blue, which is private, and the bottom is not. Um, and again, kind of it hit close to home for me because at the bottom, um, you've got Pahoa High School Intermediate, and that is on my island. You have Keao on my island, Kau, um, Konawaina, Hilo. Those are all schools that I know very well. So this was one of those things that it really kind of made me sit up in my chair, like, wow, just the things that you know intuitively, but when it's actually presented to you in this way rigorously, it kind of changes the impact. At least for me, it did. But So I do. I'll turn it back over to you because I wanted to ask, when you did break it down into the schools, is there like anything that was surprising to you, or is it kind of what you expected? Did you have kind of the same reaction that I did when you got the results in?
I think you alluded to it earlier. There was, I mean, obviously everybody has this intuition, right? That all of course, there's going to be a lot more rich people at these private schools, so they should definitely be at the top. But I think the thing that kind of struck me the most was the disparity between the top and the bottom. So if you look, as you mentioned, Pahoa is right around 0.5 in terms of economic connectedness. If you look at the bar chart, compared to Punahou and Iolani, which are, if I remember correctly, they're right. Punahou is slightly edges Iolani, which I hate to say, but Punahou and Iolani are near the top at just above or around 1.7. So if you look at Pahoa, the average poor student at Pahoa in their friend group, about 25% of their friends would be considered high socioeconomic status. Compared to Iolani and Punahou, you take the average poor student that goes to Iolani and Punahou, and their social networks are above about over 80% of their friend groups consist of people of high socioeconomic status. Again, this makes sense intuitively, but it's just that disparity is quite striking. Yeah.
And so when you take that, turning it back to our discussion here, like okay, if you have more of your friends are in that higher SES group, what does that mean? Like, how is that going to impact income or wealth or anything like that? Um, what did you find there?
Dylan, do you want to tackle that?
Sure. So we have some evidence, and when I say we, I mean the sort of the authors of the original national study that developed this measure have some evidence to suggest that this could really matter for long-run outcomes. So we see evidence that in places where there's higher economic connectedness, there's also higher intergenerational mobility according to a variety of metrics. So when I say intergenerational mobility, I mean that, say, someone who is low socioeconomic status, their children have a higher likelihood of becoming high socioeconomic status. And there are various different ways of measuring that. Some of it's based on income, some of it's based on education, some of it's more based on everything altogether. Almost no matter how you slice it, it looks like these places that have high economic connectedness also have high intergenerational mobility, that people from one generation to the next, coming from a lower socioeconomic status background, if they live in a high economic connectedness place, they're more likely to make the leap up to the sort of next like tier of the socioeconomic ladder, if you will. So there's certainly some strong correlations along those lines. We also know from the research that it goes a little bit beyond correlation, at least in the sense that we have now a great deal of evidence that suggests that moving to neighborhoods that have high economic connectedness seems to cause increases in upward mobility. But what we don't know is whether or not all of that is because of the economic connectedness. So what we really know is that moving to neighborhoods that have high upward mobility seems to cause high upward mobility. But we don't know if that's because of the economic connectedness or if it's because of other factors as well. That's somewhat uncertain at the moment. But this is part of this research is part of a sort of broader exploration of why exactly is it that neighborhood or that school seems to matter so much to upward mobility. And this is, one potential candidate for how we can explain that, is that this connectedness stuff matters. And I think there are a few sort of example stories you can tell about why it might matter. Jensen, do you want to jump in there? I think you have a few good sort of hypothetical
Yeah.
stories here.
Yeah, so I mean, in the brief, we briefly touch on it in the intro, but you can imagine that if you do have a lot of wealthy friends, they might be well attuned to job openings, or they might have uh, experience working, say in the corporate ladder, for instance, which is where we would expect a lot of these high income people to be. Personally, uh, you know, when I went to Iolani, Iolani has a stereotype of producing doctors and engineers. And, there's a very extensive alumni network that the school plugs you into when you graduate, that is able to pass along job opportunities, internships, and a lot of this information is something that you would not otherwise uh, gain access to had you not graduated from Iolani. And I'm sure a lot of schools have this, even public schools have these sorts of networks, right? um, so yeah, there's definitely a lot of mechanisms at play that can explain why perhaps this, why economic connectedness actually matters, for your upward mobility and how your long run outcomes. And I'm sure every people in the audience also will definitely have their own anecdotal examples of, hey, I know a guy who knows a guy who told me about this, and now I'm here where I am, or um, you know, just stuff like that. Yeah.
So I mean, kind of sticking with this causation kind of question about it, like why even the results that you have for the state in general, it was kind of surprising to me that Hawaii ranked so high as a state, for the schools, for in on average in general, to rank so highly. I did some extra research just real quick. There was a DBET study that looked at our Gini coefficient for the state. Anybody that doesn't know, a Gini coefficient is basically a measure of inequality, and same results. Hawaii actually ranks as less in unequal than the U.S. On a couple of measures. Um, but why do you think Hawaii is like that? Like, I off the top of my head, that's not something I would have expected. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. There might be a few explanations, and I'm not entirely sure what they are, but I mean, we can obviously, a lot of the people who've grown up here, everybody hears about the aloha spirit. There's a lot of also intermingling of cultures here in Hawaii as well. And if you supplement that with the fairly small geography of the state, and the fact that everybody happens to be so densely packed on these islands, it definitely makes sense why we should expect a lot of cross class interaction between people. You might even be able to think about, there's a very heavy reliance on tourism. And, it might be the case that having a very large tourism sector or a very large service sector, but might also contribute to a lot more cross-class interaction. So there's a lot of potential explanations. I'm not sure which one is particularly right, or which one has more power in explaining this. But Dylan, do you have any ideas?
Sure. So when it comes to the question of why inequality, according to various measures in the state, seems to look better than other states, and it's not just looking at inequality of incomes using Gini coefficient measures, but also if you look at the evidence we have about intergenerational mobility itself, it seems like the state ranks more highly than other places. Some of that is because the income distribution here looks a bit different than other states, especially this sort of after taxes and transfers. The people who are low socioeconomic status here, without sort of saying that everything's fine. Like these statistics in the aggregate can make things sound rosier than they are for, people on the ground, of course, always. But it looks like we have, a relatively higher income at the lower end of the income distribution than some other states. And also, certainly after taxes and transfers, that's the case. Again, just as compared to other states, that's not to say that there aren't people who are in difficult circumstances, but as compared to other states, that's true. Some of it's probably accounted for by that. So, if you compared people who have similar levels of income here to other states, even after adjusting for prices, maybe they don't actually look so different, when it comes to things like upward mobility. Still, I think that's not quite going far enough. We have higher upward mobility for people who are in similar circumstances than other states. So this does not provide a full explanation. Some of it might be related to a slightly better social safety net. I want to be a little cautious there because it's very hard to get a totally complete measure of what the social safety net in one state looks like compared to another state. But it seems like, based on the numbers I've seen, that's probably generally true. And, that's potentially helpful. I also think probably sometimes people here, I get the sense, are surprised to hear about things like, relatively good upward mobility because of a perception that the public schools are perhaps maybe not as good as in other states. I think that there's some uncertainty about that. I have some questions about some of those. I don't think that there's a definitive case that the public schools here are worse than in other places, sort of controlling for differences in the sort of composition of the students. So a lot of the statistics we have are based on public schools, but the private schools here take up a lot of the students. So, I mean, it's true that we definitely don't know. I don't think we have a definitive answer. And there are a few different ways of looking at it. But, in some ways, the schools here are probably, doing okay. I'm sure there's always room for improvement, but they don't look particularly bad to others compared to other states on certain measures. Maybe on other measures they do. The social safety net looks relatively strong. I think we have a lot of evidence to suggest that, especially relatively small differences in people's after-tax income, after-tax and transfer income, when they have young children, can make a huge difference to life outcomes for the children 20 years down the road. And so, potentially, that's something that needs to be kept in mind. When it comes to the economic connectedness, it turns out the story in Hawaii ends up being relatively straightforward. There's just like more high socioeconomic status people around for the low socioeconomic status people to be friends with. And combined with that, evidence that there's not much of what they call in the paper friending bias. I believe this is correct, right, Jensen? That, there is a kind of sense of what academics pretentiously call homophily, which is to say birds of a feather fly together. People like to be friends with people who are similar to themselves. And what you have in Hawaii is some evidence to suggest that, at least when it comes to socioeconomic status, there's not much of that going on. People aren't particularly choosy about the socioeconomic status of their friends relative to some other states anyway. Not everyone, not all the time, but on average, it looks like that's the case if you compare Hawaii to other places. And then there's just more high socioeconomic status people around for the low socioeconomic status people to be friends with. So that's the sort of explanation there. Those are the things that come to mind.
In the brief, we actually look at the friending bias versus what Dylan was referring to, the amount of wealthy people that just happen to be in an area. That's known as exposure, or that's what they call exposure in the original papers. So basically, we're able to decompose this measure of economic connectedness into these two factors. So how much of economic connectedness is explained by just the amount of rich people in an area versus how much of economic connectedness is explained by the fact that people may have a bias towards just befriending people of similar socioeconomic status. And if you look at the data for the high schools that we were talking about earlier, and I think it's on page 6 of the brief, I think Dylan provided the link in the chat. But if you look at the scatter plots on page 6, what you see is that the correlation between friending bias and economic connectedness in Hawaii's high schools, there appears to be very little, if at all, meaningful relationship between friending bias and economic connectedness. Whereas if you look at how much of economic connectedness is explained by exposure, or just the fact that there's happens to be a lot of rich people in a particular area, that pretty much all of the variation in economic connectedness is explained by just the fact that there happens to be more rich students in private high schools, and vice versa for in the public school case.
I'm gonna actually circle back to a couple of things that you guys said, because there's a lot in there I wanted to come back to. I'll just present both of them to you guys, um, and then you let me know your thoughts. So the kind of the density and the geography make perfect sense to me. Um, sorry, that's more of just a comment. But you had a mention about after tax and transferring. And the state just passed the biggest tax cut in our history, or 100 million years, or something like that. Which plug our next webinar on July 11th will be discussing exactly this. But knowing how much of an impact that after tax and transfer income can have for a family and for, like you said, intergenerational mobility. Can you give me some quick thoughts about that, and how that may or may not impact families' decisions on, sending their kids or trying their kids for a private school that maybe they couldn't afford before, just right off the bat?
So it's a very large tax cut that is going to be particularly large for a lot of say like lower income, lower middle income families, especially as a percentage of their sort of after-tax income, it's going to be fairly sizable. Not as sizable for the people who are maybe in like the lowest sort of income groups. And in some cases, maybe for the very lowest people, really, it doesn't offer much, although there were some changes to tax credits last year that can help those groups. But yes, it's certainly possible that for some people, this puts them in the range of being able to afford private school. And in fact, there's lots of, it turns out, of course, the people who are going to private school are disproportionately relatively high income. But it could impact that decision for a range of people, because, I mean, it improves the sort of the disposable income that's available to a range of groups, including quite high income groups. So, I mean, it's certainly possible. I think I would keep in mind that the sort of implications of, if you think economic connectedness is something that really matters a lot, there are certainly a lot of public schools that were relatively high on the economic connectedness list there. And that's going to have more to do with what neighborhoods people live in. And there, some of the benefits might be more muted, because to the extent that people are going to use any extra disposable income they have to try and move to a neighborhood that has better public schools, or like a higher income neighborhood that has more high income students, that'll to some extent just bid up housing prices, right? So that's not as likely to provide a sort of unambiguous benefit, but it might shift it so that some people who are lower in the income distribution are going to have, they're going to be a little more competitive in those housing markets than before, potentially. But I would just keep in mind that it also benefits people who are much higher up in the income distribution. And so it's hard to say. But private school affordability, potentially.
So it's actually a perfect segue. I mean, I know, I was just looking at the time. I want to make sure that we get into the discussion about the policy implications that you had in the brief. But one of the recommendations that you had in there was, well, I should say this. I thought it was really interesting how the policy prescriptions that you guys recommended didn't actually directly hit schools at all. It was a much more holistic, it was much more holistic recommendations. I thought that was a really interesting way to go about it. Um, my bias, I thought it made perfect sense. And but I wanted to dig into it with you because, like you just mentioned with the tax cuts, it could help um, somebody who normally couldn't afford a neighborhood move into a new neighborhood with a better connectedness public school. So in the same way, one of your recommendations was not school vouchers, but housing vouchers. So can you speak to that recommendation? Why did you go that way?
Um, yeah, so there's a lot of good evidence out there, especially recently, to suggest that housing vouchers do have a real impact, at least on the people who receive the vouchers and use it. Um, Junyup, who's an incoming professor at UH, he's done really great work looking at the small area fair market rent program in Houston. And I think, what Dylan described earlier with, it could be the case that these people moving to more to nicer neighborhoods will bid up housing prices. He finds, something similar, right, where you have these people who receive the vouchers, they move to these nicer areas, rents are bidded up there, but rents go down in the neighborhoods that they moved from. And so you sort of have these counterbalancing effects of the policy. I think Dylan knows a little bit more about the moving to opportunity experiment. So I think he could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I would say for me, the focus on housing and neighborhood-based policies comes down to two things. One is a sort of, we don't want to overstate what's known right now about the causal effect of economic connectedness relative to the causal effect of neighborhood. We know very well that moving people to certain neighborhoods that are high upward mobility neighborhoods, which tend to be neighborhoods with higher socioeconomic status people, higher income people, we know that that works. We just don't know exactly why it works in full detail. And so focusing on a housing policy that potentially improves access to high upward mobility neighborhoods for lower income folks is focusing on what we know works, what we have very good evidence about. Whereas I think the stuff about, moving people into, say, a high economic connectedness school, it's just a little more speculative than what we know about moving people to neighborhoods. A housing voucher program like the one that Jensen was referring to, which is really an extension of the sort of standard federal Section 8 housing voucher program, is going to be much more effective at allowing lower socioeconomic status people to access those sorts of neighborhoods than just the sort of income tax cut that I was just describing, because it's much more targeted. So it's not providing additional resources for competing in the housing market to those higher income people that perhaps you're not trying to target. It's specifically targeting the lower socioeconomic status households that you're interested in moving to these neighborhoods. So assuming that that's your objective, the housing voucher is a much more targeted way of achieving that. There's some questions about the details of exactly how to design that policy. And right now, certainly you wouldn't, if you were to advocate for pursuing that at a higher level, you can't rely on the existing policy because it's totally underfunded. So like something on the order of 20% of people maybe in Hawaii who are eligible for Section 8 housing vouchers are actually going to get them at the end of the day. And that's just because there's not enough money to finance the policy. So, I mean, I'd say we focus on the housing stuff because there's lots of evidence that it works. Like Jensen referenced, the moving to opportunity experiment, which, sort of is a randomized control trial, works the way a drug trial does. Some people were given access to housing vouchers, other people weren't. And you can see that the effects, especially of giving a housing voucher to a family that has young children, children under 10 years old, that the effects on the later life outcomes of those children are huge, that they're much more likely to be employed, they're much more likely to have graduated from college, they have higher incomes on average quite substantially, they're less likely to be on disability payments, you name it. So we know that there's something here that could potentially be used to achieve policy objectives if your goal is to sort of attenuate inequality and increase access to opportunity. And this is potentially the best way to go about it based on the evidence we have right now.
And so along the same lines, I mean, the state also just passed, I think it was 3202, the one that required higher density across the state. I know the CNC of Honolulu wasn't a big fan of that. I know people that aren't a big fan of that. But do you think that that kind of fits with your other recommendation, which was around more deregulation around housing, allowing more density around the public schools that are higher in SCS and connectedness? Um, it's it seems like it would fit into exactly what you're talking about in terms of it's not just the school, it's the neighborhood where you can have a big impact. Do you have any thoughts about that? Anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think all I'll really say is that I think there's some very solid evidence out there, especially recently, that suggests that increasing density does uh, show that there is a causal effect of reducing nearby rents. And to the extent that this evidence was put together in a rigorous way that we can trust, I think that it would make sense to kind of have a complementary approach between a housing voucher program and simultaneously making it easier to build housing here in the state. I'm sure everybody kind of knows how difficult it is to build housing here, and so why not do both? And I think it makes sense to see why both complement each other. Dylan, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, so just to complement what Jensen said already, I mean, whether it's the income tax cut or whether it was a housing voucher program, you can always make the policy more effective, especially if your goal is to get people into these higher opportunity neighborhoods by relaxing the constraints on the housing supply in those neighborhoods. If you have restrictions on the housing supply in the neighborhoods that you want to get people into, then there's only so much that can be accomplished, through public policy. The vouchers are going to maybe it's not to say that the vouchers can't do anything without easing housing supply restrictions, but do you want a percentage of your voucher money to be really benefiting like landlords, or do you want it to be benefiting the people who are being targeted? If you want it to benefit mostly the people who are being targeted, then relaxing housing supply restrictions is a sort of natural approach. And again, same thing, if you want to improve the situation of households in the state by giving an income tax cut, but there's housing supply restrictions in place that are quite severe, then a lot of that money is not going to help the people that you are targeting. It's just going to bid up home prices. It's going to bid up rents. And so you don't end up helping the people you're targeting by as much as you would like to. Now, as for this particular bill, I don't know enough about the details to comment on the specifics of this bill. But I can tell you big picture, particularly having had many conversations with my colleague Justin Tyndall about this, it's clear that there are relatively severe housing supply restrictions, and relaxing them could help a lot and enhance the sort of benefits of these types of policies we're discussing.
So let me toss out for the it's a question, but it's also something that I thought my like off the cuff response anytime I talk to somebody about education here in Hawaii, whether it be quality or I've had a few discussions telling people about this brief, like what the results were, and all of that. And my off the cuff like policy recommendation, if you want to call it that, has been more around competition in um, schooling to make it easier to start a school, to run a school. As far as I know, even the charter schools in Hawaii, they're not super charter in the same way that they are on the mainland. Um, but so that was one of the reasons that I was surprised to see your policy implications were more around um, the housing side of it. Again, like I said, like it's a much more holistic recommendation, which I find refreshing. But I did want to ask, is there a particular reason that you didn't zone in on anything to do with the DOE or with things that the private schools could be doing? I mean, returning to how I started, like uh, something that's more directly targeted towards the school industry.
So to the extent that economic connectedness is sort of causally related to improving upward mobility, and economic connectedness at schools is as well, I would say, based on my sort of knowledge of the evidence, it's to do with really like who your friends are, right? And so it's not actually about the way that the schools are being run necessarily. It's about who attends the schools. It's about peer effects. That might not be the end of the story, but so I'm not saying the schools aren't being well run. Don't get me wrong. I absolutely believe, and we do have evidence, other evidence that suggests that schools can be run in more or less effective ways. And to a lesser extent that can affect upward mobility. It's hard to get this evidence, right? Because it takes like 20 years for you to see what happens to the children. But based on what we know, my guess would be that most of it's about the peer effects. It's about who you're being put into the school with. And so then, certainly you could see a case for vouchers, potentially, if you thought that that was going to help. That's one way to get people access to better peers or different peers, and potentially vouchers could also have some appeal in the sense that they can partially, although certainly not completely or even mostly, sever the link between like where someone lives and where they're going to school. People, I think, overestimate that sometimes, but sure, there's some of that can happen as well. But the sort of more obvious thing to do, I think, if you think that really this is about who's around, is to move people to the place where they're going to be around the peers that you think they can, better benefit from. Obviously, there's a limit to how far you can go, right? Like at some point, if you had achieved the sort of ideal vision that we're sort of pitching here implicitly, like everyone would have exactly the same sort of friend group or something. And in terms of socioeconomic status composition, that's not literally true, but of course there's diminishing returns to how far this could go. But it does seem like the housing approach is sort of more obvious. But again, that's not to say that there's no room for improving the public schools, for exploring voucher policies, or things of that nature. I'd say, again, we have less clear, very definitive causal evidence about those things, which is not to say none. Most of what we have, though, is about improving test scores. So, but what we know about neighborhoods is not that they improve test scores. We know they improve like incomes, and that they improve upward mobility. And when it comes to schools, our information is sometimes a bit less clear. In the best studies, we do see some evidence that yes, indeed, better schools can lead to these improvements. And that includes both public schools and private schools. There's evidence from like some really good recent evidence comes from like school funding reforms in Michigan, I think in the late 90s, early 2000s. And, they just put more money into the public schools, more or less without doing very much, and it looks like it had some positive returns in terms of college graduation rates, in terms of reducing maybe even potentially like time spent in juvenile detention amongst the students who are attending school, that you can increase attendance rates at schools just by like renovating the facilities. You know, it wasn't obvious to me, but then I read the study and it seems like there's some evidence of that. So, I mean, some of it could be funding. It could be vouchers. I'm somewhat agnostic about exactly what the best sort of combination of inputs are there. Some of the accountability reforms that people have proposed over the years for improving public schools, there's even some evidence that some of those things can work. I don't think there's any magic bullet. People sometimes in US education reform debates think there is. I don't think the evidence supports any of that, but certainly the evidence supports the possibility that reforms could be made that could improve these things. But I just don't think we knew enough about that to really focus on those things in the study when it came to interpreting what's going on with economic connectedness. You know, it's not clear that it's about how the schools run. It seems like it's about who's around.
I think that's a good attribute to have. Thank you for being humble in your recommendations. So I'm going to turn to some audience questions that came up. One of the first ones, you kind of addressed this in the data set that you used, but one of the first questions we got was about the methodology. And I actually had the same thought or question when I read the brief. You know, the data set that you're using and basing a lot of this analysis on comes from Facebook, which is, at least as far as I know, still mainly used by like our generation or older. So do I know that the you're relying on Chetty's team and their data set. But can you speak to that? Like, do you see how that may have impacted the results? Do you think that there's anything there that you think might have been different if you had used, I don't know, sticking with social media, Instagram or TikTok or whatever it is that the kids are using nowadays?
Yeah, so I think I can't, obviously we weren't privy to what exactly they did in the data wrangling process. What I can say is that the advantage of the Facebook data is that it definitely gives you access to this very granular data set of people's social networks that we would definitely not be able to get through typical survey based designs like the ones conducted by the census. And from what I understand of the data, it's true that, I guess, or it may or may not be true, that people who are older tend to use Facebook more than, I'd say, people of my generation. But at the same time, the data is representative of the U.S. population, more or less. And I think Chetty and his colleagues definitely did, go through a lot of, cross validation, making sure the data set also, or making sure the results look the same using data other than Facebook. I'm not exactly sure how they went through the validation process. But as I also mentioned, they pooled all that information together with a lot of publicly available data sets that everybody uses, such as the ones provided by the census as well. Dylan, do you have any?
Yeah, just to add on to that. So I believe my understanding, so it's true that there is a little bit of a black box component from our perspective, that we don't have full information about exactly what they did, but I think we have enough information to say that, they were focused on an older cohort, that essentially, like, Jensen is not in the study, he's too young. Right, but you or I, Laren, maybe we are. Actually, I'm Canadian, so I don't know if I would have been in the country at the time, but yeah. In any case, I think that they focused on a cohort that at the time they collected the data was 25 to 65. Jensen, is that right?
I think it's 25 to 40 something, maybe, or maybe
okay.
it was 20, yeah.
So even narrower. That's and I don't remember precisely what year they collected all that information, but it was at least a few years back. And so this is a cohort that at some point, at least, if less so recently, was using Facebook in a way that was fairly extensive, and they were maybe not everyone was their best friend, but for stuff like this, we have a lot of evidence that weak ties can matter as well as sort of stronger ties. And so it's probably not an unreasonable way to figure out what people's social networks look like. And as Jensen says, the alternatives are just unwieldy, and you never would have been able to collect national level data. There have been some small studies where they've asked like high school students and college students and people generally, like, list your friends and plotted social networks that way. But that's very labor intensive and very costly. So I think they did a reasonable job with the information available, from what I can tell.
All right, thank you, thank you. Another question we had revolves around, it's actually near and dear to my heart as well, but um, is there a question of, the way I'm reading this is more general inequality, but for Hawaii, is it a matter of the pie just not being big enough? And the way that I'm interpreting the question, the way maybe it's my bias, but the way I'm reading it is in the sense of, should we be spending more time thinking about increasing GDP versus how we can improve something like economic connectedness?
I suppose I wouldn't think of the two as mutually exclusive necessarily. So again, economic connectedness, like, do we know that if you improve economic connectedness, that that's going to like fix everything or make everything so much better? I don't know that we know that for sure. I think we know that, again, you can achieve a lot in terms of improving intergenerational mobility by moving people to certain neighborhoods that have high economic connectedness. And this is one of the things that might be responsible for that. It's not clear to me that that's sort of substantially at odds with increasing like the total size of the pie, because the evidence we have suggests that, it's not just that like people, these sort of kids from low-income backgrounds, when they find themselves in a better neighborhood, it's not just that they, do better and they're sort of like higher ranked now relative to everyone else. They sort of do better in an absolute sense. And it's not what we don't know maybe yet. What's the missing piece is, like, if I move all of the sort of low socioeconomic status kids to a high socioeconomic status neighborhood, does that have some negative impact on the high socioeconomic status kids? I don't think that we necessarily know the answer to that question yet. But usually the gains that you get from raising up people sort of further down in the distribution, in terms of just from a fiscal perspective for the state, a lot of the time are higher, at least than people who are in the middle. Because usually there's pretty high effective marginal tax rates at the bottom of the distribution, because you have all these sort of benefits that are getting phased out. Now, many of those benefits are paid for by the federal government, but some of them are paid for by the state. And so I think, there's some substantial benefits to be gained from just a fiscal perspective, holding constant everything about our current system, from targeting people at the bottom. Now, and it's possible that it enhances GDP as a whole. I don't know if we know that for sure, but it's not obvious to me, at least, that these are sort of things that are juxtaposed with each other. That, I think we have a lot of reason to believe that if you spend money to improve human capital, like get more people into school, get more people graduating college, that can be beneficial for the whole economy in the long run. And in some cases, it might even pay for itself. I tell my students about these examples we have from the evidence all the time, that, especially if you tax these people later in their lives when their income is higher, a lot of the time it can pay for itself to invest in, improving someone's chances of graduating from college or something. So it's not clear to me those things are at odds.
Thank you. And then one last question, and then there are other questions that got submitted. I'm sorry if we don't have the time for it, but as one last question that I did want to pose, it's again something more along the lines of methodology, um, but I do think it's important in informing the results. How are the friends being defined in the Facebook data? Is it just if you have a connection, then you're counted as a friend, or was there more to it?
Yeah, so at a crude level, yes, it's if you are friends on Facebook. More specifically, both of you have to be mutuals, so one person can't just be following the other. So you have to be mutual contacts, but they also trim the data so that you have to have been active within the last month or so. You must have had to have more than 100 friends, and you must have also had to have a bunch of, for example, location details on your account as well. So they don't include anybody who does not have their zip code or their high school or their college in their Facebook account. But essentially, yes, friends means Facebook friends, but also there's research out there to suggest that actually the friends that you make actually particularly on Facebook are actually people who you interact with offline. So again, I know Dylan mentioned, it's not a perfect measure. Ideally, we'd in a perfect world we'd have the perfect data set, but this is as close as we can get to getting a proxy for pretty much a very large sample of the U.S. population's individual social networks.
Sorry. With that, I'm gonna have to bring us to a close, just in the interest of time, to respect everybody's participation here. Really quickly, I did want to also embarrass Jensen just a little bit. He was a recipient of an HEA scholarship, so we are just delighted to have him back now as a panelist. And it's a reminder for all of us, we want to be able to support this kind of thinking. We want to support people examining issues in this way. And this is a small way to do it by supporting organizations like ours. So thank you very much, Jensen. Thank you very much, Dylan. I'm gonna share really quickly, just to show off some upcoming events that we have. Dylan and Jensen, you're more than welcome to join us, although I know one of you is not around. So we will be doing an economics trivia night on the 26th. This is an all ages event. Please come out and just show us how much you think you know and how much you actually do know. You'd be surprised how big the gap is there. And like I said, some upcoming events that we have besides our next one, our next webinar will be about the tax relief bill. That'll be moderated by another director with the HEA, Seth Colby. We have a rate change in August for our annual membership. So here's a heads up. If you want to renew, please do it now. And on October 18th, we will have our annual conference. Like I said, this webinar is being recorded. We'll share it on YouTube. Um, please go ahead and review it and think about it and keep the discussion going. Wanted to thank you. Oh, also, sorry. Um, we also have our feedback form. Let us know how we did. Um, this will also be emailed to all of the registered viewers, so you can click on the link in the email that you get and give us some feedback. There are some chat topics in the chat for us to explore maybe later on. If you have any ideas for future topics, please let us know. So again, thank you very much to Jensen. Thank you very much to Dylan. And thank you everybody for joining us. Have a great rest of the afternoon.